just beyond a quiet Polish city, where tram lines once rattled past open fields and people went about ordinary lives. A place existed that was never meant to be hidden. Smoke drifted upward in plain sight. Barbed wire cut the horizon. At night, the sky glowed faintly, not from factories or street lamps, but from something far darker. This was Majdanek, a camp so close to civilian homes that neighbors could hear the shots, smell the burning, and watch prisoners march past their windows. Unlike other camps buried deep in forests, Majdanek stood exposed, unfinished, chaotic, and deadly, a place where starvation killed as efficiently as gas, where paperwork mattered as much as bullets, and where tens of thousands died without the world looking away, because the world was already there. Tonight, we're not rushing through dates or numbers. We're walking slowly through how this camp came to exist, how it operated in plain sight, and how ordinary systems were turned into instruments of mass death. Settle in, listen closely, and stay with this story, because Majdanek wasn't hidden in the shadows of history. It was built in the open, and what happened here still echoes far beyond its fences. The ground was still frozen when the first prisoners arrived, their boots slipping on hard earth just beyond the edge of a living city. They could hear dogs barking somewhere behind them, smell coal smoke drifting from chimneys in the distance, and see church spires rising above rooftops not far away. This was not a remote forest or a hidden valley. This place was open, exposed, and unmistakably close to ordinary life. Wooden stakes had been hammered into the soil. Barbed wire glinted faintly in the cold light. Guards shouted orders that echoed across empty fields. No one yet knew the name Majdanek, but something permanent had begun. In the autumn of 1941, the German occupation of eastern Poland had entered a new phase. The invasion of the Soviet Union had pushed the front lines far to the east, and with that expansion came millions of captured soldiers, civilians, and political enemies. The Nazi system was already strained by overcrowded prisons and camps, and the eastern territories were being reshaped at brutal speed. Cities were reorganized, populations reordered, and entire regions turned into logistical zones for conquest. Lublin, an old city with deep cultural roots, suddenly found itself transformed into an administrative hub of occupation. Rail lines converged there. Roads radiated outward. For the men planning Germany's future in the East, it was a convenient center of control. Orders came down from the highest levels of the SS. Heinrich Himmler, obsessed with both security and expansion, approved the creation of a new camp near Lublin. On paper, it was meant to serve practical needs, a place to hold prisoners of war, a labor reservoir for future construction projects, a buffer against unrest. The official name was Konzentrationslager Lublin, a bureaucratic label that concealed its potential. There was no grand architectural plan at first, no completed vision, just a directive to build quickly, cheaply, and at scale. The chosen site lay on the southeastern edge of the city, near a small district known locally as Majdanek. The land was flat and windswept, open fields stretching toward the horizon. From the nearest homes, the camp would be visible. From the camp, the city would never disappear from view. This was not an accident. The SS believed visibility itself could be a weapon. Fear traveled faster when people could see the fences, hear the shots, and smell the smoke. The camp would stand as a warning, a constant reminder of power. Construction began in haste. Prisoners were forced to build their own confinement. They dug trenches with numb hands, hauled timber across muddy ground, and raised crude barracks that leaked cold and damp. There was no time for comfort, and no concern for survival. Guards watched from temporary towers, rifles slung casually, boots planted firmly on ground that belonged to no one anymore. The air carried the sharp scent of freshly cut wood mixed with sweat and fear. At night, wind howled across the open fields, slipping through unfinished walls and rattling loose boards. The first inmates were primarily Soviet prisoners of war, captured in vast numbers during the early months of the Eastern Campaign. Many arrived already starving, wounded, or sick. There were no proper facilities to house them, no adequate food, no medical care. They slept packed together on bare floors, breathing shallow clouds of condensation into the freezing air. Disease spread quickly. Dysentery, typhus, and exhaustion claimed lives faster than bullets. Bodies were dragged outside and stacked like debris, their faces already gray, their names forgotten almost immediately. Yet even as men died by the hundreds, the camp continued to grow. More barbed wire was strung. Additional barracks rose in uneven rows. Administrative offices took shape. The chaos was not a flaw. It was the foundation. Majdanek was not yet an extermination center, but it was already a place where human life held no measurable value. Death was not an outcome to be prevented. It was an accepted cost. From nearby streets, civilians could see columns of prisoners being marched through the fields. They could hear shouted commands carried by the wind. Some claimed later they smelled something strange even then, long before crematoria existed, a mixture of rot, smoke, and waste that clung to the air on certain days. Others said they learned to look away, to treat the camp as part of the landscape, like a factory or rail yard. Life in Lublin continued under occupation, but a new shadow had settled at its edge. Inside the SS bureaucracy, Majdanek's purpose was already shifting. The war in the East was not unfolding as planned. Prisoners of war were dying too quickly to be useful. Labor demands were growing. The German vision for the region involved not just military control, but racial restructuring. Camps were no longer temporary solutions. They were becoming permanent instruments. Majdanek's location made it ideal for expansion. Rail connections allowed for easy transport. Open land allowed for growth, and its proximity to the city ensured constant oversight. The camp command structure solidified. Guards rotated in from other SS units, bringing with them habits learned in Dachau and Sachsenhausen. Discipline hardened. Punishments became more systematic. Beatings were no longer spontaneous, but routine. Roll calls stretched for hours in freezing rain or blazing sun. Prisoners learned quickly that obedience offered no safety, only the illusion of survival. Every morning brought uncertainty. Every night brought the question of who would still be breathing by dawn. What made Majdanek different, even in these early months, was its unfinished nature. Unlike older camps refined through years of operation, this place was being invented in real time. Mistakes were corrected through cruelty. Inefficiencies were solved by killing faster. There were no traditions yet, only improvisation guided by ideology. The camp was a living experiment in domination, its methods evolving with terrifying speed. As 1941 turned into 1942, new categories of prisoners began to arrive. Polish political detainees, civilians accused of resistance, Jews swept up in local actions. Each transport tightened the pressure inside the fences. Space shrank. Food diminished. Violence escalated. The camp's purpose was no longer ambiguous to those inside it. Whatever Majdanek had been intended to be on paper, in reality, it had become something far darker. The city remained close. Trains rolled in and out. Church bells rang on Sundays. Children played in streets not far from watchtowers. The contrast was unbearable, and yet it persisted. For the SS, this closeness reinforced control. For prisoners, it was a constant torment, a reminder of a normal world that felt impossibly distant despite being visible through the wire. By the time winter loosened its grip on the land, Majdanek was no longer just a camp under construction. It was a functioning machine of suffering, already integrated into the Nazi system of occupation. Decisions made in offices far away were now shaping lives here, one transport at a time. And behind those decisions, another plan was forming, larger and more lethal than anything Majdanek had yet seen. The fences stood, the barracks filled, the city watched, and somewhere beyond the paperwork and orders, a new phase was approaching. One that would transform Majdanek from a place of mass death through neglect into something far more deliberate, far more final. The camp did not pause after those first deaths. It did not reflect or correct itself. It absorbed them and moved forward, tightening its grip as if the suffering had confirmed that it was working exactly as intended. When the ground thawed and the mud returned, Majdanek no longer felt temporary. The fences no longer felt provisional. Something heavier settled into the air, a sense that this place was not waiting to become anything else. It already had. At first, the SS still spoke the language of necessity. Prisoners of war needed to be housed somewhere, they said. Labor had to be organized. Order had to be maintained in the newly conquered East. But inside the camp, the reality was obvious. Soviet prisoners continued to arrive in waves. Skeletal men herded off trains and marched into barracks that were already overcrowded. Many collapsed before they reached the gates. Guards dragged them aside without comment. No records were updated. No questions were asked. Death was so common that it barely interrupted the routine. The transition was quiet, almost invisible. There was no single order that announced the change. No speech delivered to assembled guards. Instead, it happened through small decisions, repeated daily. Food rations were cut again. Work hours stretched longer. Medical care remained non-existent. Prisoners who could no longer stand were selected not for treatment, but for removal. A camp meant to hold prisoners of war was becoming something else entirely, shaped not by international law or military convention, but by ideology and convenience. Inside the SS administration, the failure of the original plan was already acknowledged. Too many prisoners were dying too quickly to be useful as labor. The Eastern Campaign had created a flood of captives that no existing system could manage. Camps were expected to absorb them, exploit them, and discard what remained. Majdanek, unfinished and flexible, became an ideal testing ground. Its purpose expanded not because it was planned that way from the start, but because the system demanded it. New prisoners arrived who were not soldiers at all. Polish civilians accused of resistance. Intellectuals, teachers, priests, men and women arrested in street roundups. They entered a camp that was still defining its rules, still improvising its cruelty. Guards treated them no differently. Orders were barked. Batons fell. Names dissolved into numbers. Whatever a prisoner had been before arriving here ceased to matter the moment they crossed the wire. The camp's internal geography began to change. Sections were reorganized. Barracks were reassigned. Areas once intended for short-term detention became long-term holding zones. The chaos of early construction gave way to something more deliberate. Watchtowers multiplied. Patrols tightened. Punishment blocks filled. Majdanek was learning how to function, and what it learned came at the cost of human lives. For prisoners, the days blurred together. Morning roll calls stretched endlessly, bodies swaying as men fought to remain upright. The sound of boots in mud, the snap of commands, the sharp crack of rifle butts against ribs. Hunger gnawed constantly, a dull ache that never faded. At night, coughing echoed through the barracks, punctuated by quiet sobbing and the whispered prayers of those who still believed someone might be listening. Outside the fences, the world continued to operate with disturbing normalcy. Trains ran on schedule. Markets opened. Occupation authorities issued decrees and collected taxes. The camp was visible, yet its meaning remained deliberately obscured. Official language reduced it to a facility, a site, a labor camp. The truth lived in the details no report ever captured. The smell of unwashed bodies, the way fingers curled inward as strength failed, the silence that followed executions carried out just beyond the barracks. As 1942 approached, Majdanek's role shifted again. The Nazi leadership had begun implementing broader plans for population control and annihilation across occupied Poland. Camps were no longer simply tools of repression. They were becoming instruments of mass murder. While Majdanek had not been designed as a pure killing center, its infrastructure made adaptation easy. It already held thousands. It already functioned outside any legal framework. It already normalized death. Transports of Jewish prisoners increased steadily. Some came from nearby ghettos, others from regions further away. They arrived exhausted, carrying whatever they had been allowed to keep, still clinging to the hope that this was another temporary stop. That illusion did not last long. Selection procedures emerged, informal at first, then increasingly systematic. Those deemed too weak were removed. Those who resisted were beaten publicly. Terror became instructional. The SS refined their methods. Guards learned which punishments broke spirits fastest. Starvation was paired with labor to ensure maximum exhaustion. Disease was allowed to spread unchecked, turning barracks into slow-motion killing zones. Death became layered, unfolding over days or weeks rather than moments. For administrators, this efficiency mattered. Fewer bullets were needed. Fewer guards were required. The camp itself did the work. Majdanek's proximity to Lublin now served another function. The camp became a hub, a sorting center feeding other camps and labor sites. Prisoners were transferred in and out, sometimes without explanation, sometimes without record. The system expanded outward, linking Majdanek to a growing network of violence. Each connection made the camp more essential, more embedded in the machinery of occupation. Inside the barracks, prisoners sensed the shift even if they could not name it. Rumors spread in whispers, stories of mass killings elsewhere, of camps designed only for death. Some refused to believe them. Others recognized the signs. The guards' behavior had changed. The indifference had deepened. There was less shouting now, less need to assert authority. Control had become absolute. The camp command tightened its grip. Regulations multiplied. Infractions were punished collectively. Entire barracks were forced to stand for hours because one man collapsed or spoke out of turn. The goal was no longer discipline alone. It was submission, the stripping away of individuality until prisoners ceased to see themselves as human beings at all. Yet even as the camp grew more lethal, it remained unfinished. Construction continued alongside killing. New structures rose while others decayed. This constant state of becoming gave Majdanek a particular brutality. There were no stable routines to adapt to, no predictable patterns to exploit. Survival depended on reading subtle changes, on understanding the mood of a guard, the timing of a transport, the unspoken rules that shifted without warning. By mid-1942, Majdanek could no longer be described honestly as a prisoner of war camp. The term had lost all meaning. What existed instead was a hybrid institution, part labor camp, part concentration camp, part death site. Its function was whatever the SS required on any given day. Its victims were whoever the system deemed disposable. The city remained close enough that prisoners could sometimes hear music drifting from open windows, laughter carried on the wind, the distant clatter of dishes being washed. These sounds cut deeper than beatings. They reminded inmates that life continued elsewhere, uninterrupted, indifferent, that the camp was not a rupture in reality, but a feature of it. For the SS, Majdanek had proven its value. It absorbed prisoners efficiently. It killed without excessive oversight. It terrified the surrounding population. It could be adapted, expanded, repurposed. In a system driven by ideological obsession and logistical necessity, those qualities mattered more than anything else. As summer approached, new plans were already being discussed. Larger transports, new killing methods, greater integration into a broader operation unfolding across occupied Poland. Majdanek had crossed a threshold without ceremony or announcement. It was no longer a place struggling to define itself. It had found its role, and that role was about to deepen. As decisions made far beyond the camp's fences began to pull Majdanek into a campaign of destruction that would leave no ambiguity about what this place was meant to become. The camp no longer felt like a work in progress. It felt deliberate. What had once looked improvised now revealed a pattern, one that prisoners learned to read not through maps or instructions, but through pain. Every step taken inside Majdanek carried meaning. Every fence line, every path carved into the mud, every door that opened or stayed shut had been arranged to control bodies, movement, and ultimately life itself. Architecture here was not about shelter. It was about dominance. At dawn, the camp revealed its full shape. From the watchtowers, guards looked down on a landscape divided into strict compartments, each enclosed by layers of barbed wire that hummed faintly when the wind passed through. The fences were electrified, not always consistently, but often enough that no one tested them twice. Beyond them stood rows of wooden barracks, long and low, their roofs sagging under rain and snow, their walls thin enough that voices, coughing, and crying seeped through day and night. The ground between them was churned into thick mud by thousands of boots, turning movement itself into exhaustion. The layout was simple, and that was its genius. Straight lines, clear sight lines, no hiding places. Prisoners were always visible, always exposed. Guards could see everything from their towers, and prisoners knew they were being watched even when no one seemed present. Surveillance became internalized. People learned to monitor themselves, to regulate their own movements, to hesitate before speaking or standing too tall. The camp did not need constant violence to maintain order. Its structure did much of the work. Each section of Majdanek served a purpose, though prisoners were rarely told what that purpose was. Barracks for sleeping, if that word could even be used. Blocks for punishment, where screams carried farther than anywhere else. Administrative buildings where decisions were made quietly, with ink and stamps, determining who would live another day and who would not. Paths connected everything, wide enough for marching columns, narrow enough to feel constricting. There was no randomness in how people were moved. Flow was controlled. Bottlenecks were intentional. Inside the barracks, the smell was overwhelming. Damp wood, unwashed bodies, waste that could not be properly disposed of. In winter, cold seeped through every surface, biting into skin and bone. In summer, heat turned the air thick and stale, making it hard to breathe. Bunks were stacked 3 levels high, wooden planks with little space between them. Prisoners pressed together for warmth, or simply because there was nowhere else to go. Sleep came in fragments, broken by roll calls, by guards bursting in, by the sound of someone dying nearby. Roll call squares sat at the heart of the camp, open expanses of bare ground where prisoners were assembled sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. These spaces were central by design. Everyone passed through them. Everyone feared them. Standing motionless while bodies collapsed beside you was part of the routine. Guards counted and recounted, their numbers rarely matching, their frustration taken out on those forced to wait. Rain-soaked clothing, frost-numbed fingers and toes, sunburned skin raw. The body learned to endure in ways the mind struggled to follow. The crematoria and killing facilities were positioned with chilling pragmatism, close enough to transport bodies efficiently, far enough that smoke and smell could be partially dispersed, though never fully hidden. Prisoners assigned to these areas learned the rhythms of death faster than anyone else. They heard the machinery. They saw the ash. They understood what the camp was becoming before most. Many did not last long enough to share that knowledge. What made Majdanek especially brutal was how unfinished it remained. Some barracks were sturdier than others. Some areas had drainage. Others flooded constantly. Prisoners transferred between sections experienced the camp differently, depending on where they landed. Survival could hinge on geography. A few meters closer to a watchtower, a few steps farther from food distribution, a slightly leakier roof. Architecture became fate. The SS refined the camp's layout as they observed how prisoners reacted to it. If a path allowed people to cluster, it was widened or narrowed. If a barracks bred resistance, its occupants were redistributed. If an area allowed momentary privacy, it was opened up. Nothing remained neutral for long. The camp evolved in response to human behavior, always in ways that increased control and suffering. The punishment blocks stood apart, both physically and psychologically. Prisoners could see them from a distance, dark shapes that carried a reputation stronger than any fence. Those taken there often did not return, and if they did, they came back changed. Broken bones, hollow eyes, silence where words used to be. The architecture of punishment was meant to be seen, to radiate fear outward, to discipline not just the individual but everyone who watched. Even the placement of latrines served a purpose. Overcrowded, unsanitary, exposed, they stripped away dignity. Guards sometimes withheld access as punishment, forcing people to relieve themselves in public, under watchful eyes. Shame became another tool, another layer of degradation built into the physical environment. The camp attacked not only the body, but the sense of self. For guards, the architecture offered comfort and separation. Their quarters were sturdier. Their pads were elevated or fenced off. Their view was one of order, not chaos. From above, the camp looked organized, controlled, efficient. The suffering below was filtered through distance and routine. This separation made cruelty easier. When pain was part of the landscape, it became unremarkable. Prisoners quickly learned that knowledge of the camp's layout could mean survival. Knowing where a guard was likely to stand, which pads were watched most closely, where shadows fell at certain times of day. This knowledge was shared in whispers, traded like currency, but it was fragile. A single change, a new tower, a shifted patrol could erase it overnight. Majdanek's architecture also allowed for constant expansion. New barracks could be added with minimal disruption. Fences could be extended. Sections could be repurposed. This flexibility mattered as transports increased and the camp's role deepened. The ground beyond the existing perimeter was already marked, already measured, waiting. The camp was never finished because it was never meant to be. From the outside, it may have looked crude, even haphazard. But from within, Majdanek felt precise in its cruelty. Every structure reinforced the same message. You are trapped. You are visible. You are replaceable. The camp spoke this language without words, repeating it through wood and wire, through mud and smoke. As prisoners moved through this space day after day, the camp reshaped them. Bodies adapted to cold and hunger. Minds adapted to constant threat. Time lost meaning. The physical environment trained people into submission, into routines that felt safer than thinking. The architecture did not simply contain suffering. It produced it. And yet, even as Majdanek perfected its control over space, something else was happening. The camp's layout was being evaluated for new uses, new functions, new methods. Decisions were being made that would alter not just how prisoners lived here, but how they died. Structures that had once served one purpose were about to be transformed into something far more final. The camp stood ready. The paths were clear. The fences held. And the architecture that had already mastered control was about to be turned fully toward extermination, as Majdanek entered the darkest phase of its existence. Morning did not arrive gently in Majdanek. It tore people awake. Whistles cut through the barracks before the light had fully risen, followed by boots striking wood, rifles slamming against doors, voices barking commands that allowed no delay. Sleep evaporated instantly, replaced by panic and muscle memory. Bodies slid from bunks stiff with cold and exhaustion. Feet hit dirt floors already slick with mud tracked in from the night before. The air inside the barracks was thick, sour with sweat, waste, and sickness, a smell that never truly faded no matter how long one lived inside it. Outside, the cold wrapped itself around exposed skin like a second punishment. Prisoners stumbled into formation, still buttoning threadbare jackets, hands shaking as they tried to stand straight. Roll call could last minutes or hours. No one knew which it would be. Guards counted, then counted again. If the numbers did not match, everyone stayed. Knees locked, back straight, eyes forward. Those who collapsed were dragged aside, sometimes beaten awake, sometimes left where they fell. By the time roll call ended, some prisoners had already died without a word being spoken about it. Food followed, if it could be called that. A thin liquid passed off as soup, often little more than hot water with floating scraps. Bread, when it appeared, was dense and rationed so tightly that every crumb mattered. Hunger was constant, a deep ache that sharpened the senses and dulled everything else. Prisoners learned to eat slowly, to stretch the experience, even though the taste was almost non-existent. Eating too fast meant feeling the emptiness return sooner. Work began immediately after. Labor details formed quickly, assigned without explanation. Some prisoners were sent to construction sites inside the camp, hauling stones, digging trenches, expanding the very place that was killing them. Others were marched outside the fences to nearby factories, workshops, or row projects. The marches themselves were ordeals. Guards enforced pace with batons and rifle butts. Anyone who stumbled risked being beaten or shot. The sound of boots on gravel became a rhythm of suffering that echoed through the camp day after day. The work was relentless and deliberately exhausting. There were no allowances for illness, injury, or age. Bodies already weakened by starvation were pushed beyond endurance. Hands blistered and split open. Backs bent under loads far heavier than anyone should have carried. Sweat-soaked clothing in summer, freezing stiff in winter. Pain became a background noise, something always present, something that could never be escaped. Punishment was woven seamlessly into daily life. A miscommand, a slow response, a glance held too long could result in a beating. Sometimes punishment was collective. An entire barracks would be forced to stand at attention for hours because one man had fallen out of line. This turned prisoners against one another, breeding resentment and fear. Survival depended not only on avoiding guards, but on avoiding becoming a burden to those around you. Disease spread easily in these conditions. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. Lice crawled through clothing and hair, impossible to eliminate. Medical care existed mostly in name. The infirmary was a place people feared. Those sent there often did not return. Treatment was minimal, and selections were frequent. To be deemed too sick was to be marked for death. Prisoners learned to hide illness, to work through pain, to stay upright no matter the cost. Nights offered little relief. After hours of labor, prisoners returned to barracks that provided no real rest. The bunks were overcrowded, bodies pressed together so tightly that turning over required coordination. Coughing echoed through the darkness. Groans slipped out when guards were not nearby. Sleep came in short bursts, interrupted by nightmares and the constant awareness that morning would bring it all back again. Emotionally, life in Majdanek was a slow erosion. At first, many prisoners clung to memory. Faces of loved ones, streets they once walked, meals they once ate. Over time, these memories became painful rather than comforting. The contrast between past and present was unbearable. Some stopped speaking entirely. Others talked constantly, filling the air with stories as if words themselves could keep death at bay. Time lost meaning. Days blurred into one another, measured only by roll calls and meals. Seasons changed, but inside the camp it felt like one endless stretch of suffering. Prisoners learned to read small signs instead. The sound of a particular guard's footsteps, the way smoke rose from the crematoria, the arrival of new transports. These details became markers of time, replacing calendars and clocks. Violence was unpredictable, and that unpredictability was intentional. Guards sometimes passed by without incident, only to explode moments later over nothing at all. This randomness kept prisoners constantly on edge. There was no formula for safety. Obedience did not guarantee survival. Silence did not protect you. The camp trained people to expect the worst at all times, to live in a state of constant alertness that drained what little strength they had left. Yet even here, human bonds formed. Prisoners shared food when they could, whispered warnings about dangerous guards, helped one another stand during roll call. These small acts carried immense risk. Being caught could mean death. But for many, they were the only way to hold onto a sense of humanity. In a place designed to strip people down to nothing, kindness became an act of resistance. The psychological toll was immense. Watching others die daily hardened some prisoners, while breaking others entirely. Guilt haunted those who survived when friends did not. Shame followed those forced to make impossible choices. The camp demanded constant moral compromise, and it punished anyone who tried to remain whole. Children, when they appeared, suffered especially. Smaller bodies weakened faster. Hunger hit them harder. Fear consumed them more completely. Some clung to adults, others withdrew into silence. Their presence underscored the cruelty of the system, but it did not soften it. The camp made no exceptions. As months passed, prisoners sensed that daily life was becoming more lethal, not less. Work details grew harsher. Food rations shrank further. Selections became more frequent. The balance between exploitation and extermination was shifting. Life in the barracks felt more fragile, more temporary, as if the camp itself were preparing for something larger. Rumors circulated constantly. Whispers of gas chambers, of mass shootings elsewhere, of camps designed solely for killing. Some dismissed these stories as exaggerations born of fear. Others believed them immediately. The atmosphere inside Majdanek thickened with anticipation, a sense that what had already been endured was only the beginning. And as prisoners struggled through another night on wooden planks, bodies aching, stomachs empty, minds racing, the camp continued to evolve around them. Decisions were being made beyond their sight, plans forming that would soon transform daily suffering into organized mass death, pulling Majdanek deeper into the machinery of genocide. They arrived in waves, and each wave changed the camp. New faces altered the balance inside the barracks. New languages filled the air. New fears reshaped the rhythm of survival. Majdanek was never a single-purpose camp because the people in prison here were never a single group. Its population shifted constantly, and with every shift, the cruelty adapted. The camp learned how to break different kinds of people in different ways. At first, many prisoners still believed there must be a logic behind who was sent here. Soldiers thought their uniforms would protect them. Civilians thought arrests were temporary. Intellectuals believed their education might make them useful. But Majdanek did not operate on logic that resembled the outside world. The only thing that mattered was usefulness in the moment, and even that could vanish without warning. Soviet prisoners of war continued to form a large part of the camp's population. They arrived exhausted from long marches, many already wounded, some barely conscious. Their treatment was especially brutal. They were considered disposable, enemies beyond redemption. Guards beat them openly, starved them deliberately, and allowed disease to spread unchecked. Entire groups disappeared within weeks. Their deaths barely registered in camp records, if they were recorded at all. Polish political prisoners followed in growing numbers. Teachers, students, former soldiers, members of the resistance, anyone suspected of opposing German rule. They often arrived with no understanding of what Majdanek was. Arrested in dawn raids or swept up in mass roundups, they entered the camp still clinging to legal assumptions that no longer applied. Those assumptions were stripped away quickly. Titles, professions, achievements meant nothing here. Survival required learning the rules of a system designed to erase identity. Then came the Jews, increasingly, relentlessly. Some arrived from nearby ghettos, forced onto trains with what little they could carry. Others came from farther away, transported across occupied Europe. Families were often separated upon arrival. Confusion and terror filled the air as orders were shouted in languages many did not understand. The camp absorbed them methodically, processing people as units rather than individuals. For Jewish prisoners, Majdanek was not just a place of imprisonment. It was part of a broader campaign aimed at annihilation. Roma and Sinti prisoners arrived as well, labeled asocial, undesirable, unfit. They were treated with the same contempt, subjected to the same hunger, labor, and violence. Their presence was often barely acknowledged by camp authorities, yet their suffering followed the same brutal patterns. Entire families vanished into the camp's routines, leaving no trace beyond whispered memories among survivors. What united these groups was not shared experience before arrival, but shared degradation afterward. Clothing was stripped away and replaced with rags. Names were replaced with numbers. Hair was cut. Bodies were inspected and categorized. From that moment on, everyone was reduced to function and weakness. The camp did not care why someone had been imprisoned. It only cared how long they could be used. Inside the barracks, differences persisted, sometimes creating tension. Language barriers made communication difficult. Cultural habits clashed under extreme stress. Hunger intensified conflict. A stolen piece of bread could mean death. Yet over time, these divisions often softened. Suffering leveled people. Shared fear created fragile bonds. Prisoners taught one another survival strategies, passed along rumors, warned each other about dangerous guards or upcoming selections. The SS exploited differences whenever possible. They favored some groups over others, granting small privileges to certain prisoners to deepen resentment. Capos, often chosen from among prisoners themselves, enforced discipline with violence. Some abused their power brutally. Others tried quietly to protect those under them. This system fractured solidarity, making resistance harder and survival more isolating. Children appeared occasionally, their presence shocking even to hardened prisoners. Small bodies struggled under oversized clothing. Hunger hollowed their faces quickly. Some clung to parents, others wandered silently, eyes too old for their age. The camp did not adjust for them. Work demands, rations, punishments remained the same. Childhood disappeared almost instantly upon arrival. Women experienced the camp differently, but no less brutally. They endured forced labor, hunger, disease, and violence, often compounded by sexual abuse and exploitation. Separation from children or partners added layers of suffering that words could not fully capture. Their barracks became places of whispered grief, shared endurance, and quiet strength, even as death remained constant. The arrival of new transports was always tense. Prisoners watched from behind wire as trains unloaded human cargo. Some recognized faces. Others saw reflections of themselves from months earlier. The sound of crying, shouting, confusion drifted across the camp. For those already inside, these arrivals were reminders that the system was expanding, not slowing. That there would always be more bodies to replace the dead. As populations shifted, so did labor assignments. Stronger prisoners were reassigned repeatedly until their strength failed. Skilled workers were exploited longer, but not spared. Once usefulness declined, selection followed. The camp categorized people continuously, evaluating bodies like resources. Survival became a race against exhaustion, illness, and arbitrary judgment. Death took many forms, and it did not discriminate by category. Some were beaten to death in moments of rage. Others starved slowly. Disease claimed those who had illness too long. Executions removed those deemed troublesome. For Jewish prisoners especially, mass killing loomed increasingly close, even when it was not yet fully visible. Fear was constant, but its source shifted from day to day. Despite everything, identities did not vanish entirely. Prisoners held on to fragments. A song hummed quietly at night. A prayer whispered under breath. A shared memory spoken softly between bunks. These moments were dangerous, forbidden by exhaustion and surveillance, yet they persisted. Humanity survived in pieces, even as the system tried relentlessly to grind it away. The camp population was never stable long enough to become predictable. This instability was itself a weapon. New prisoners disrupted fragile routines. Transfers erased friendships. Death removed those who had learned how to survive. Nothing could be relied upon except change, and change always favored the camp, never the prisoner. As 1942 moved forward, Majdanek's population grew larger and more complex, woven directly into the machinery of occupation and genocide. The camp was no longer simply imprisoning people. It was sorting humanity itself, deciding who would be exploited longer and who would be erased quickly. And as these decisions accelerated, the line between living and dying inside Majdanek grew thinner with each arriving train, pulling the camp closer to its most lethal purpose yet. Work began before strength returned to the body. There was no pause between survival and labor, no space where hunger eased or fear lifted. In Majdanek, work was not a means to an end. It was the end itself. It consumed the prisoner slowly, methodically, until there was nothing left to extract. Every day, the camp demanded movement from bodies already breaking, and when those bodies failed, they were discarded without ceremony. The labor details formed quickly after roll call, names shouted or simply pointed at, assignments handed out with indifference. Prisoners did not choose their work. Work chose them. Some were sent to construction crews inside the camp, expanding barracks, reinforcing fences, digging drainage trenches that never fully worked. Others were marched beyond the wire to factories, quarries, road projects, or SS-run workshops scattered around Lublin. The marches were long, exhausting, and enforced with violence. Falling behind was interpreted as defiance. Defiance was punished immediately. The work itself was intentionally inefficient. Tasks were designed not to produce value, but to drain strength. Prisoners carried heavy stones from one end of a field to the other, only to carry them back again. Trenches were dug, filled in, then dug again. Earth was moved endlessly. Guards watched closely, not to ensure productivity, but to catch signs of slowing, of hesitation, of collapse. The moment a body faltered, it became a target. Inside workshops, conditions were no better. Prisoners repaired uniforms, sorted confiscated belongings, assembled equipment for the German war effort. Fingers bled. Eyes strained. Mistakes were punished harshly. Hunger made concentration nearly impossible, yet perfection was demanded. Skilled workers were exploited longer, but not protected. Once their hands shook too much or their eyesight failed, they were replaced. Food did not increase with labor. Rations remained minimal, sometimes shrinking further. The imbalance was deliberate. The SS understood exactly how much work a starving body could perform before it broke. Forced labor became a killing process stretched over weeks or months instead of minutes. The camp did not need bullets to empty itself. Work did the job quietly. Weather offered no mercy. In winter, frozen ground resisted shovels, forcing prisoners to strike it again and again until their hands went numb. Breath turned to frost in the air. Sweat-soaked clothing that then froze solid during brief pauses. In summer, heat pressed down relentlessly, dust filling lungs, dehydration causing dizziness and collapse. Guards responded with beatings, accusing prisoners of faking weakness. Punishment and labor blended seamlessly. Prisoners who angered guards were assigned to the hardest details, carrying the heaviest loads, digging in the worst conditions, standing for hours holding stones above their heads. These punishments were public, meant to discourage others. The message was clear: work harder or suffer more. For many, labor outside the camp fences offered a cruel illusion of freedom. The city was visible. Streets, buildings, civilians passing by. Some prisoners caught brief glimpses of normal life, of people buying food or walking unhurriedly. These moments cut deeply. They reminded prisoners of everything that had been taken, everything that felt unreachable even when it stood just meters away. The SS profited from this system. Forced labor fed directly into the German war economy. Factories received free workers. Construction projects advanced without concern for human cost. Confiscated goods sorted by prisoners flowed back into the system. Majdanek became an economic asset as well as a tool of terror. The suffering it generated was converted into material benefit. Inside the camp, exhaustion reshaped social dynamics. Prisoners too weak to work were resented, not because they deserved it, but because their weakness attracted punishment for others. Entire groups could be penalized if one person collapsed. Hunger sharpened these tensions. Survival often demanded emotional withdrawal. Caring too much became dangerous. Yet even in this environment, cooperation persisted. Prisoners shared techniques to conserve energy. How to lift without injuring the back. How to slow work just enough to survive without being noticed. How to trade tasks quietly. These strategies were passed in whispers, gestures, brief glances. Knowledge became a form of resistance. The camp administration monitored labor output constantly. Lists were kept. Bodies were evaluated. Prisoners were reassigned repeatedly, squeezed for every remaining ounce of usefulness. Once usefulness ended, selection followed. The transition from laborer to victim was often sudden. One day you worked. The next day you were gone. Children, when forced into labor, suffered especially. Their smaller bodies collapsed faster. They struggled to keep pace, to carry loads designed for adults. Many did not survive long. Their deaths were absorbed into the camp's rhythm without acknowledgement. Women faced their own brutal labor assignments. Heavy construction, factory work, sorting belongings taken from the dead. Sexual exploitation added another layer of violence, unspoken but ever present. Strength failed quickly under these conditions, and failure was fatal. As the months passed, forced labor in Majdanek intensified rather than eased. The war demanded more. The SS responded by demanding more from prisoners who had nothing left to give. The camp became louder with commands, harsher with punishments, faster in replacing the dead. Labor no longer disguised killing. It was killing. Prisoners began to sense a shift. Work details thinned as bodies disappeared faster than they arrived. Rumors spread of new methods, of places where people were not worked at all, only killed. Majdanek's role was changing again. Forced labor remained central, but it was no longer enough. The system was accelerating. By the time many prisoners realized this, they were already too weak to respond. Hands that once lifted stones now trembled. Legs that once marched now dragged. The camp watched closely, calculating, deciding who still had value and who had reached the end of their usefulness. And as forced labor continued to grind bodies into nothing, Majdanek moved closer to a moment when work itself would no longer be necessary, when killing would become faster, more organized, and far more final, pulling the camp fully into the machinery of mass extermination that was already unfolding across occupied Poland. By the time the prisoners sensed that Majdanek was changing again, the change had already been decided far beyond the camp's fences. Orders were no longer shaped only by local commanders or immediate needs. Majdanek was being drawn into something wider, darker, and far more systematic. What had once been a camp defined by improvisation, neglect, and brutal exploitation was now being aligned with a coordinated plan whose purpose was unmistakable. The machinery of genocide was tightening, and Majdanek was being fitted into its gears. Trains began arriving with greater regularity. Not just prisoners, but instructions. Not just bodies, but intent. The SS no longer spoke vaguely about security or labor when discussing the camp's future. Language shifted toward efficiency, capacity, throughput. These were not words of detention. They were words of extermination. Majdanek was no longer standing at the edge of Nazi policy. It was moving toward its center. Across occupied Poland, a massive operation was unfolding, one designed to eliminate Jewish life entirely from the region. Ghettos were being liquidated, communities erased. Camps constructed for a single purpose were already operating at full capacity. Majdanek had not been built for this role originally, but that no longer mattered. It had space. It had rail access. It had guards trained in cruelty. It had a population already conditioned to death. Adaptation was not difficult. Inside the camp, prisoners noticed changes first in the details. New sections were fenced off. Movement became more restricted. Selections occurred more frequently, and with greater finality. Those taken away did not return. Smoke lingered longer in the air. The sound of gunfire echoed more often, sometimes for hours at a time. The camp no longer pretended that death was incidental. It was becoming central. Jewish transports increased dramatically. Entire families arrived together. Confusion etched into their faces as they were forced from overcrowded rail cars. Some believed they were being resettled. Others sensed the truth immediately. The camp processed them with growing speed. Belongings were seized. People were separated. Those deemed unfit for labor vanished almost instantly. The rest were absorbed into a system that had already decided their fate. Majdanek's role within the broader operation was complex and evolving. Unlike camps designed solely for killing, it functioned as a hybrid. Some prisoners were worked to death. Others were killed outright. Some were held temporarily before being sent onward. This flexibility made Majdanek valuable. It could adjust to shifting demands, absorbing overflow when other camps were overwhelmed, serving as a buffer in the expanding system of annihilation. The SS refined procedures relentlessly. Guards became more efficient, less visibly emotional. Killing became routine, bureaucratic. Lists replaced improvisation. Timetables replaced chaos. Death was scheduled. Prisoners learned to recognize the signs. A sudden clearing of space. Guards in unfamiliar formations. Orders delivered with unusual calm. These moments froze the air with dread. The camp's proximity to Lublin now took on new meaning. It allowed rapid coordination, swift movement of goods, bodies, and information. The camp was no longer just visible to the city. It was integrated into its wartime infrastructure. Trucks came and went. Trains passed through. The killing happened close enough to everyday life that it blurred into the background noise of occupation. Inside the barracks, rumors spread faster than ever. Stories from other camps filtered in through new arrivals. Accounts of gas chambers, of mass shootings in forests, of camps where no one worked, only died. Some prisoners refused to believe it, clinging to the hope that work still meant survival. Others understood that survival itself was becoming temporary, conditional, fragile. The psychological atmosphere shifted. Where fear had once been sharp and immediate, it now became heavy and suffocating. Prisoners sensed that the camp was no longer merely punishing them. It was emptying itself, systematically. The future shrank. Hope became dangerous. Planning beyond the next day felt pointless. For the SS, Majdanek's transformation was proof of success. The camp demonstrated how quickly a facility could be repurposed when ideology demanded it. There was no need for secrecy, no need for explanation. Orders were followed without question. Guards adapted easily. Killing became another task, no different in tone from roll call or labor assignment. The camp's killing methods expanded alongside its role. Executions increased. Shooting pits filled. New facilities were prepared. Prisoners assigned to these areas understood what was happening long before others. They saw the scale. They smelled it. They carried bodies until their arms failed. Many were killed afterward to erase witnesses. Knowledge itself became a death sentence. The integration into the broader operation also meant that Majdanek's population became more transient. People passed through quickly, sometimes staying only days. Records blurred. Names vanished. The camp became a place where identity dissolved almost instantly. For those already imprisoned there, this turnover intensified isolation. Friends disappeared overnight. Familiar faces were replaced by strangers doomed just as quickly. Outside the camp, the genocide advanced with ruthless efficiency. Ghettos emptied. Towns went silent. The absence was palpable, even if rarely spoken aloud. Majdanek stood as both a destination and a waypoint, part of a network that stretched across occupied Poland. Its fences were just one barrier in a system designed to leave no escape. Inside the SS hierarchy, confidence grew. The operation was working. Resistance was fragmented. International attention was minimal. Killing on this scale had become normalized within the system. Majdanek's role, once secondary, now felt indispensable. It filled gaps. It absorbed excess. It ensured that no pause in killing ever occurred. For prisoners, the camp now felt heavier, darker, more final. The daily routines of hunger and labor continued, but they were overshadowed by the knowledge that something worse was happening alongside them. Death was no longer just a risk. It was the destination, delayed only by usefulness or chance. Some prisoners attempted to document what they saw, to memorize details, to carry the truth forward if they survived. Others shut down entirely, retreating inward as a form of protection. Both responses were dangerous. Awareness brought despair. Numbness brought vulnerability. There was no safe way to exist in a place designed to erase existence itself. As Majdanek settled fully into its role within the broader campaign of extermination, the camp lost whatever ambiguity it had once possessed. It was no longer a place that could be misunderstood. Its purpose was becoming unmistakable, written into the smoke, the silence, the constant arrival and disappearance of human beings. And as the operation intensified, Majdanek prepared for its next transformation, one that would push killing to an even more industrial scale, tightening the system further and leaving behind evidence so vast that even the perpetrators would one day struggle to erase it. The first signs were subtle, almost easy to miss amid everything else. A new building taking shape near the edge of the camp. A section of fencing reinforced and closed off. Guards posted more tightly than usual, their movements sharper, quieter. Prisoners sensed it before they understood it. Something had shifted again. The air felt heavier. The routines carried a different weight. Death, which had always lingered nearby, was being brought closer, formalized, contained. For months, killing in Majdanek had been constant but uneven. People died from hunger, disease, beatings, exposure, executions carried out with bullets or blunt force. Now the SS sought something faster, something that required less improvisation. The camp had grown too large, the population too fluid, the demands of the broader operation too pressing. Efficiency was no longer a preference. It was a requirement. Construction continued behind guarded perimeters. Prisoners assigned to these details were sworn to silence through terror. They worked under watchful eyes, assembling structures whose purpose was never explained aloud but quickly understood. Thick doors, sealed spaces, openings cut high into walls, pipes installed with care. Those who worked closest felt a cold certainty settle in their stomachs. They had seen enough elsewhere. They knew what this meant. When the gas chambers became operational, there was no announcement. No moment marked in time. Killing simply took on a new shape. Transports arrived and disappeared more quickly than before. Groups were led away and never seen again. The camp's rhythm changed. The pauses between arrivals and absences shortened. Smoke rose more steadily. Ash settled invisibly over everything. The process was deliberately deceptive. Prisoners were told they were going to be disinfected, to shower, to undergo medical procedures. The language was calm, routine. People were instructed to undress, to place their belongings neatly. Some complied in silence. Others hesitated, sensing danger but unable to name it. Guards responded with shouting, blows, the crack of rifle stocks against flesh. Fear accelerated compliance. Inside the chambers, space disappeared quickly. Bodies pressed together. Breath grew shallow. Panic erupted as doors sealed, and the truth became undeniable. The sound was not a single scream, but many, layered and overlapping, muffled by thick walls. Outside, guards waited, checking watches, smoking cigarettes, carrying out tasks with practiced detachment. Death was measured in minutes. Zyklon B was used, its crystals releasing gas that filled the sealed space. Those inside fought for air, clawing at one another, at walls, at anything that might offer escape. The strongest lasted the longest, prolonging their own suffering and that of others. Children died first. Elderly bodies collapsed quickly. The gas did not discriminate. It consumed everything alive within reach. When the doors were opened, silence poured out. Prisoners assigned to Sonderkommando units were forced to enter, to drag bodies out, to untangle limbs locked together in final spasms. Faces were frozen in expressions of terror, mouths open, eyes wide. The smell was overwhelming, a mix of chemicals and death that clung to skin and clothing no matter how often they washed. These prisoners worked under the knowledge that their own lives were temporary. Witnesses were liabilities. Many were killed after weeks or months and replaced by others. The system erased itself continuously, attempting to leave no living memory behind. Not all killings took place in gas chambers. Mass shootings continued, especially during periods of high volume. Prisoners were marched to pits, ordered to undress, forced to lie atop bodies still warm beneath them. Shots rang out in steady rhythm. Earth absorbed blood quickly. These methods were brutal but efficient, and they complemented the mechanized killing happening elsewhere in the camp. Majdanek became a place where multiple killing methods operated simultaneously. Starvation, labor, shooting, gassing, disease. The variety did not lessen the horror. It multiplied it. Death became inescapable, arriving from every direction, at every hour. For prisoners not immediately selected, awareness of the chambers changed daily life profoundly. Fear sharpened. Compliance increased. Hope collapsed. People watched one another more closely, trying to predict who would be next. Conversations grew shorter. Silence spread. To acknowledge what was happening openly felt dangerous, even fatal. The SS maintained strict control over information, but rumors traveled anyway. Prisoners shared fragments. A smell that would not fade. A building no one returned from. Ash found in unexpected places. Knowledge circulated in whispers, carried on breath between bunks at night. Each piece confirmed the same truth. Majdanek was no longer merely a camp where people died. It was a camp designed to kill. The proximity to the city made this phase especially grotesque. While gas chambers operated, life continued nearby. Trams ran. Shops opened. People went about their routines. The killing did not stop for daylight or weather. It existed alongside ordinary life, separated only by fences and denial. Guards adapted easily. Many treated gassing as preferable to shooting. Less effort, less mess, less personal involvement. The distance created by sealed doors and chemical agents reduced even the minimal psychological burden some had felt. Killing became cleaner, more abstract, easier to repeat. Prisoners assigned to auxiliary tasks noticed changes in disposal as well. Crematoria struggled to keep pace. Bodies piled up. Open-air burning supplemented indoor facilities. Smoke thickened the sky, especially on days when transports were large. The smell spread farther, impossible to ignore. Even those who tried not to see could not avoid breathing it in. The camp's capacity for killing expanded steadily. Procedures were refined. Timing improved. The system learned from itself. Mistakes were corrected not to save lives, but to end them faster. The camp absorbed lessons from elsewhere and applied them without hesitation. Inside the barracks, despair deepened into something heavier. People stopped imagining survival beyond days or weeks. Some gave away possessions. Others clung fiercely to life, driven by instinct alone. The psychological toll was crushing. Living beside a killing center meant existing in constant proximity to the end, hearing it, smelling it, sensing it even when it was out of sight. Children, when present, were particularly vulnerable. Many were sent directly to the chambers upon arrival. Those who remained briefly experienced terror beyond comprehension. Their cries echoed longer in memory than any other sound. The camp did not slow for them. It did not soften. Women faced the same selections, the same deception, the same end. Some tried desperately to stay with children or relatives, knowing what separation meant. Others were torn away violently. The process was designed to fracture bonds quickly, to prevent resistance, to keep movement flowing. As this phase intensified, Majdanek's role within the broader system became undeniable. It was no longer a supporting site. It was an active killing center, integrated fully into the machinery of genocide. Its methods were not identical to other camps, but the outcome was the same: erasure. Yet even here, traces of humanity persisted in fragments. A hand squeezed in the dark, a whispered prayer, a name spoken one last time. These moments did not stop death, but they defied the system's attempt to reduce people to nothing. The gas chambers changed everything. They marked a point of no return. What had once been brutal became systematic. What had once been chaotic became organized. Majdanek crossed fully into its most lethal form, one that would soon culminate in an event so massive, so openly violent, that even this camp of death would struggle to contain it. And, as killing accelerated, preparations were already underway for a single action that would eclipse everything that had come before, turning Majdanek into the site of the largest one-day massacre the camp system would ever witness. The infirmary did not smell like medicine. It smelled like rot, damp straw, sweat soaked into wood, and fear that had nowhere left to go. Prisoners who were sent there understood immediately that this was not a place of healing. It was a holding space between usefulness and death, where bodies were examined not to be saved, but to be judged. To cross its threshold was to feel time shorten. Men and women arrived, carried by others, dragged on blankets, or stumbling in under their own fading strength. Some had wounds from beatings that never healed properly. Others burned with fever, their eyes glassy, their breathing shallow and uneven. Lice crawled freely through hair and clothing. Groans echoed softly, broken by coughing fits that racked entire bodies. The weak were packed tightly together, not separated for care, but concentrated for convenience. Doctors stood above them, wearing clean coats that created a cruel contrast with the filth beneath their boots. Some were trained physicians. Others wore the title without the conscience that once belonged to it. Their examinations were brief, impersonal, and final. A glance, a touch, a decision. There was no conversation, no reassurance, no explanation. Prisoners learned to read faces, to search desperately for signs of mercy that almost never came. Selections happened constantly, sometimes openly, sometimes quietly. A nod to the left, a finger pointed to the right. Those chosen for death were removed quickly, before panic could spread. Others were left behind with the false hope that survival meant recovery. But recovery was not the goal. The infirmary was a filter, separating bodies that could still be worked from those that could not. Medical neglect killed as effectively as any weapon. Infections went untreated. Broken bones were ignored. Open wounds festered. Fever burned unchecked until delirium took over. The camp did not need to administer lethal doses. It simply withheld care until death arrived on its own. For administrators, this method required less effort, less documentation, and less moral confrontation. Yet cruelty went further than neglect. Medical abuse became another tool of control. Prisoners were subjected to procedures without consent, without explanation, without anesthesia. Injections were administered that caused pain, paralysis, or rapid decline. Some were given substances to observe reactions. Others were deliberately infected or left exposed to extreme conditions to study endurance. These acts were not conducted in secrecy. They were normalized within the camp, stripped of ethical concern. Those chosen for such experiments often did not survive long enough to be studied fully. Their deaths were written off as expected outcomes. The bodies were removed, replaced by others. The process repeated. Knowledge was extracted through suffering, though its value was often dubious. What mattered was not scientific advancement, but the assertion of absolute power over the human body. Nurses, both prisoners and SS auxiliaries, were forced into impossible roles. Prisoner nurses tried quietly to help when they could, sharing scraps of food, cleaning wounds with water alone, offering comfort with words. These acts were dangerous. Being caught aiding someone deemed unfit could result in punishment or death. Yet some continued, driven by instinct rather than hope. The infirmary was also a place where despair concentrated. Prisoners whispered final messages to those around them, knowing they might not leave alive. Names of children, spouses, parents passed from mouth to mouth, fragile attempts to keep memory alive. Some begged to be sent back to work, knowing labor might buy time. Others begged for death, unable to endure the slow erosion any longer. For Jewish prisoners especially, the infirmary was often a direct path to extermination. Illness marked them as expendable. There was no effort to restore health. Selection meant disappearance. For others, it was a gamble. A few days of rest might restore strength enough to survive another cycle of labor. But rest was rare. Fear never receded. The psychological violence was relentless. Prisoners learned to hide illness, to mask pain, to stand upright, even when bodies screamed to collapse. Coughs were suppressed. Fevers endured silently. Infections were concealed beneath rags. Survival demanded deception of one's own suffering. To admit weakness was to invite death. Children who entered the infirmary rarely left. Their bodies could not withstand neglect. Their cries echoed longer than those of adults, sharp and piercing, until exhaustion stole even that. Staff did not intervene. Guards did not look away. The system absorbed their deaths without pause. The abuse of medicine extended beyond the infirmary. Camp doctors conducted inspections during roll calls, scanning faces for signs of illness or weakness. A single gesture could condemn someone. The fear of being noticed kept prisoners rigid, alert, desperate to appear strong. Health became performance, an act maintained until collapse. Some doctors took personal pleasure in their authority. Others hid behind routine, convincing themselves they were following orders. That responsibility lay elsewhere. Either way, the outcome was the same. Medicine, once a symbol of care, became another mechanism of annihilation. Bodies piled up faster during outbreaks of disease. Typhus swept through barracks repeatedly, carried by lice and filth. Instead of quarantine or treatment, the response was punishment. Barracks were sealed. Prisoners were left inside without aid. Death spread unchecked. When the outbreak burned itself out, survivors were reassigned, and the space was reused. For those forced to handle the dead, the experience etched itself deeply. Carrying bodies of people who had spoken moments earlier. Seeing faces distorted by fever and fear. Laying them out in rows, stacking them for transport. These prisoners lived with constant knowledge that they were next, that their own bodies would soon be lifted the same way. Medical abuse blurred the line between killing and letting die. The camp no longer needed to choose explicitly. It created conditions where death was inevitable, then observed it. Responsibility dissolved into procedure. Guilt was spread thin across many hands, until no one felt it individually. Yet even here, resistance flickered. Prisoner doctors falsified records when they could, hiding the sick among the healthy. Nurses swapped places on lists. Some delayed selections by arguing quietly, buying hours or days. These acts rarely changed outcomes, but they mattered to those who experienced them. They reminded prisoners that the system had not erased all conscience. As time passed, the infirmary's role became more central. It was no longer a marginal space. It was a sorting hub, feeding the killing process. Decisions made there rippled outward, determining labor assignments, transports, executions. The medical staff became gatekeepers of life and death. The presence of this system deepened the camp's atmosphere of dread. Prisoners feared not only hunger and violence, but sickness itself. A cough could be fatal. A fever could end everything. The body, once a source of resilience, became a liability. And as Majdanek continued its descent, medical abuse became another layer of its machinery, quieter than gunfire, less visible than gas chambers, but just as lethal. It prepared the camp for what came next, a moment when killing would no longer be hidden behind neglect or procedure, but carried out openly, on a scale so vast that even Majdanek systems would strain to contain it. Resistance in Majdanek did not look like uprisings or open revolt. It did not announce itself with gunfire or explosions. It lived in quieter places, in decisions made under breath, in movements so small they could disappear if watched too closely. To survive here required a kind of resistance that did not draw attention, a daily refusal to vanish completely, even as the system tried relentlessly to erase every trace of self. From the moment prisoners crossed the gates of Majdanek, they were pushed toward isolation. The camp was designed to break connections, to turn people inward, to make survival feel like a solitary act. Yet human beings resisted this instinctively. Even in exhaustion, even in terror, people searched for one another. A shared glance during roll call, a whispered warning passed down a line, a hand steadying another when legs began to buckle. These moments carried risk, but they also carried meaning. Survival itself became a form of defiance. Simply remaining alive another day denied the camp its ultimate goal. Prisoners learned quickly that strength was not only physical. It was mental, emotional, social. Those who survived longest were often not the strongest bodies, but the ones who adapted, who read the camp's moods, who learned when to disappear into the crowd and when to step forward just enough to avoid suspicion. Knowledge spread quietly. New arrivals were taught rules that did not exist on paper. Never volunteer. Never be last in line. Learn which guards were cruel for pleasure and which followed routine. Learn which days selections were likely, which blocks were watched more closely, which work details were survivable. This information was currency. It passed from mouth to ear in fragments, incomplete but invaluable. Some prisoners organized mutual support networks without ever naming them as such. Groups formed within barracks, bound by shared language, background, or circumstance. They shared food when they could, redistributed clothing, helped hide the sick during inspections. These actions were small, but each carried the risk of severe punishment. The camp worked to destroy solidarity precisely because solidarity threatened control. Acts of resistance often looked like compliance from the outside. A prisoner slowing work just enough to conserve strength without drawing attention. Another deliberately making a mistake that damaged equipment. Someone else miscounting supplies, causing confusion that delayed production. These actions rarely changed outcomes in a visible way, but they disrupted the camp's rhythm. They reminded prisoners that the system was not all-powerful, that it could still be nudged, however slightly. Some resistance was internal, fought entirely within the mind. Prisoners recited poems silently, replayed memories, reconstructed streets and homes in their imagination. These acts preserve identity. The camp sought to reduce people to numbers, to bodies in motion. Memory pushed back against that reduction. Remembering became an act of refusal. Religion played a role for some. Prayers whispered into sleeves, rituals adapted to scarcity, faith practiced without symbols or community. For others, belief faltered under the weight of suffering. But even doubt became part of resistance. Questioning the meaning of what was happening preserved the ability to think, to judge, to feel outrage. Indifference was the camp's greatest victory. Feeling anything at all, even despair, meant the system had not fully succeeded. Children resisted in ways adults could not. They asked questions. They cried openly. They clung to caregivers. Their presence itself was a disruption in a place designed for efficiency. Guards reacted with cruelty, but the children's very existence exposed the moral emptiness of the system. For those who tried to protect them, survival became inseparable from responsibility, a burden that often proved fatal but was carried anyway. Women found strength in shared endurance. They braided hair when possible, cleaned wounds with scraps of cloth, offered comfort during the long nights. These acts restored fragments of dignity. They reminded one another that they were still human beings, still capable of care. The camp tried to erase femininity, motherhood, connection. These quiet gestures pushed back against that erasure. Resistance also took the form of witnessing. Prisoners memorized names, faces, events. They counted transports. They remembered dates. Some scratched notes on scraps of paper and hid them in walls or buried them in the ground. They did not know if anyone would ever find them. The act itself mattered. It asserted that what was happening would not pass into silence without a trace. The cost of resistance was high. Those caught were beaten, tortured, executed. Entire barracks could be punished for the actions of one person. The camp relied on this fear to prevent organization. Yet even knowing this, prisoners continued to resist in whatever ways they could. Fear did not eliminate defiance. It reshaped it. Survival strategies evolved constantly. When one method became dangerous, another emerged. Prisoners learned to read not just guards, but the camp itself. The sound of trucks arriving, the smell of smoke changing, the sudden quiet before selection. Anticipation became a skill. Those who sensed danger early sometimes escaped it by chance, by positioning, by luck that felt almost supernatural in its rarity. Friendships formed under extreme pressure. They were intense, fragile, often brief. People bonded quickly, shared secrets, made promises they knew might not be kept simply because time would run out. When one friend disappeared, the loss cut deeply. Mourning had to be internal, compressed, silent. There was no space for grief in the camp schedule. Yet grief lingered anyway, shaping survivors long after liberation. Not all resistance was altruistic. Some acts were driven by desperation, self-preservation at any cost. Prisoners sometimes betrayed others to save themselves. The camp encouraged this, rewarding informants, exploiting fear. These moments fractured trust and deepened trauma. Resistance existed alongside moral compromise, and survivors carried the weight of both. Despite everything, the camp never fully extinguished the human impulse to choose. Even when choices were terrible, even when all options led to suffering, choosing still mattered. It preserved agency in a place designed to eliminate it. Choosing to share food, to speak, to remember, to survive one more day. These were acts of resistance, however small. As time passed, survival itself grew more precarious. The camp's killing mechanisms intensified. Resistance became harder, riskier. It did not disappear. It adapted, just as the camp did. The struggle between control and defiance played out daily, silently, invisibly, in the smallest details of life. And as Majdanek moved closer to one of the most violent moments in its history, these fragile networks of survival and resistance would be tested beyond anything they had yet endured, confronted by an event so vast and so sudden that even the quiet acts of defiance would struggle to hold against it. The morning began with an unfamiliar stillness, the kind that felt wrong the moment prisoners sensed it. There was no shouting at first, no rushed commands spilling into the barracks before dawn. Instead, the camp seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind felt muted as it moved across the open fields. Those who had survived long enough in Majdanek understood instinctively that silence could be more dangerous than noise. Silence meant preparation. Roll call came earlier than usual. Prisoners were forced out of the barracks in near darkness, herded into formation with unusual speed. Guards moved with precision, not rage. Their faces were set, unreadable. This alone sent a chill through the ranks. Violence driven by anger was familiar. Violence driven by planning was something else entirely. As the lines formed, prisoners noticed new units positioned around the camp. Unfamiliar faces, heavier weapons. The perimeter felt tighter. Escape, always impossible, now felt unthinkable. Trucks rumbled nearby, engines idling. The sound carried across the camp, low and constant, like a warning that refused to fade. Prisoners exchanged glances but spoke little. Words felt dangerous. Everyone sensed that whatever was about to happen would be large, decisive, and irreversible. Some clutched each other briefly, fingers brushing sleeves before snapping back to attention. Orders came quickly after roll call. Entire sections of the camp were isolated. Jewish prisoners were separated with brutal efficiency. There was no pretense, no explanation offered. Guards shouted names, pointed, dragged people from lines. Confusion erupted, followed by panic as the reality became clear. Families were torn apart in seconds. Children screamed. Mothers tried to hold on. Fathers were beaten away. The camp that had perfected cruelty now unleashed it at full force. The prisoners were marched toward a section of the camp that had been prepared in advance. Trenches had been dug, wide and deep. From a distance, they might have looked like ordinary construction work. Up close, their purpose was unmistakable. The ground smelled damp and metallic, freshly disturbed earth mixed with something darker. The pit stretched farther than the eye could comfortably follow. Guards forced prisoners to undress as they reached the edge. Clothing was stripped away in freezing air, bodies shaking not just from cold, but from terror. Personal belongings were seized methodically, sorted even as death loomed. Shoes piled up, coats stacked neatly. Everything was processed. Even now, efficiency mattered. The first shots rang out without ceremony. A single crack, then another, then many, merging into a continuous roar. Prisoners were ordered to lie face down atop bodies, already bleeding into the soil. Bullets tore through flesh, bodies jerking violently before going still. The trenches filled quickly. Blood soaked into the earth, darkening it until mud and flesh became indistinguishable. The killing did not stop. It did not slow. It accelerated. Groups were marched in waves, shot, replaced immediately by the next. The sound was relentless, echoing across the camp and into the surrounding countryside. Prisoners elsewhere were forced to listen, unable to look away, unable to escape the knowledge of what was happening just beyond their view. Music was played over loudspeakers to drown out the gunfire. The sound drifted across the camp, grotesquely cheerful against the backdrop of mass murder. The attempt to mask the violence only made it more horrifying. The contrast burned itself into memory. Those who survived would recall that sound for the rest of their lives. This was Action Ernefest, the harvest festival. In a single day, tens of thousands were murdered across Majdanek and nearby camps. It was the largest single-day massacre of Jews carried out by the Nazi camp system. The scale was unprecedented, the brutality absolute. It was designed to eliminate remaining Jewish laborers in the region swiftly, decisively, without the delays of transport or processing. The executioners worked in shifts, rotating to maintain pace. Ammunition was resupplied continuously. Bodies were layered efficiently to conserve space. When trenches filled, more were dug. The earth itself seemed to give way under the weight of what was being done to it. Prisoners assigned to auxiliary tasks were forced to witness the aftermath. They dragged bodies. They covered pits with soil. They cleaned blood from surfaces where possible. Many were killed afterward to eliminate witnesses. The system devoured even those it used to facilitate its own operation. Throughout the day, fear spread like a living thing through the rest of the camp. Prisoners waited, unsure if their turn would come next. Some prayed. Some dissociated entirely, retreating inward as a means of survival. Others watched closely, committing every detail to memory, determined that if they lived, the world would know what had happened here. The city nearby continued to exist. People went about their lives. The sound of gunfire carried beyond the camp fences, but explanations were readily accepted. Training exercises, security operations, occupation bred compliance as efficiently as terror bred silence. Majdanek did not hide what it was doing. It did not need to. By nightfall, the trenches were filled. The air was heavy with smoke, blood, and exhaustion. Guards moved through the camp with grim satisfaction. The operation had been completed successfully. Records were updated. Orders fulfilled. Tens of thousands were gone, erased in a matter of hours. For those who remained alive, the world felt emptied. The barracks were quieter than they had ever been. Familiar faces were gone. Entire communities vanished in a single day. The absence was suffocating. Survival now carried an unbearable weight. To be alive felt like betrayal, like theft. In the days that followed, the camp resumed its routines as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Roll calls continued. Labor assignments resumed. Hunger persisted. But something fundamental had shifted. The scale of violence had shattered any remaining illusions. Majdanek was no longer just a place where death happened. It had revealed itself fully as a place designed to erase existence on command. Prisoners struggled to comprehend what they had witnessed. Language failed. Numbers felt meaningless. How could so many lives disappear so quickly, so completely? The mind resisted understanding as a form of self-defense. Yet memory persisted, vivid and relentless. The SS attempted to conceal the evidence. Pits were covered, ash scattered, witnesses eliminated, but the scale made erasure impossible. The earth itself had been altered. The camp carried the imprint of the massacre in ways that could not be undone. Action Ernefest marked a turning point. It was both an end and a beginning. It closed one phase of killing and ushered in another. For Majdanek, it represented the culmination of its role within the genocidal system. The camp had proven its capacity for mass murder beyond any doubt. And as the machinery of death slowed temporarily after this outburst of violence, the survivors were left in a transformed landscape, one where the absence of tens of thousands echoed louder than any gunshot, and where the future, once uncertain, now felt terrifyingly close to collapse. After the gunfire stopped, Majdanek felt hollow, not quiet in a peaceful sense, but emptied, as if something vital had been torn out of the ground itself. The camp still stood, the fences still hummed faintly in the wind, the watchtowers still cast long shadows, but the density of life that had once filled the barracks was gone. Whole sections were suddenly sparse. Bunks lay empty. Familiar coughs, voices, footsteps had vanished overnight. For those who remained, survival took on a different shape. It was no longer about enduring constant influx. It was about existing inside absence. The SS knew the balance had shifted. Action Ernefest had accomplished its immediate goal, but it had also left behind evidence too vast to ignore. The ground had been disturbed on a massive scale. Ash clung to clothing, to hair, to the very air. Even guards moved differently now, more alert, more cautious. The war beyond the camp was changing, and for the first time in years, the direction of fear was beginning to turn inward. Rumors filtered in slowly at first, carried by new prisoners, by guards who talked too much, by distant sounds that did not belong to the camp. The Eastern Front was no longer holding. German forces were retreating. Cities once confidently occupied were being contested. The Red Army was moving west, steadily, relentlessly. At first, this knowledge felt abstract to prisoners. Liberation was a word too large to grasp, too dangerous to believe in. Hope had been weaponized against them too many times before. But the camp itself began to reflect the pressure. Administrative routines grew erratic. Orders contradicted one another. Construction projects were abandoned halfway through. Guards were reassigned suddenly, replaced by others with less familiarity, less confidence. The smooth efficiency that had defined the camp at its most lethal began to fracture. Majdanek was no longer expanding. It was bracing. Prisoners noticed changes in the guards' behavior. Some became more brutal, lashing out with desperation, as if violence could reassert control. Others withdrew, performing their duties mechanically, avoiding eye contact. A few grew nervous, jumpy at sudden sounds, glancing toward the horizon more often than toward the prisoners. Power, once absolute, was beginning to feel conditional. Evacuation plans emerged quietly, not shared with prisoners, but visible through action. Transports were organized not to bring people in, but to take them out. Labor-capable prisoners were selected and marched away, sent deeper into the Reich, toward camps still operating at full capacity. These marches were brutal. Food was scarce. Guards shot those who could not keep up. The roads themselves became killing grounds, littered with bodies left where they fell. Those left behind sensed the danger immediately. Evacuation did not mean rescue. It meant uncertainty and often death. Prisoners faced impossible calculations. To be selected might mean survival, or it might mean dying along the road. To be left behind could mean liberation or execution before retreat. No option felt safe. Every choice carried the weight of chance. The camp population thinned unevenly. Some barracks emptied completely. Others remained crowded with those deemed unfit to march. The sick, the weak, the forgotten. These prisoners lived in constant fear that they would be killed to erase witnesses, that the camp would be burned to the ground with them still inside. The SS had done it before elsewhere. There was no reason to believe Majdanek would be spared. Evidence destruction began in earnest. Guards forced prisoners to exhume mass graves, to burn bodies, to scatter ash. The work was frantic, poorly coordinated, driven by panic rather than precision. The scale of killing made concealment impossible. There was too much ground to cover, too many remains, too little time. Smoke rose again, thick and acrid, carrying the unmistakable smell of death across the fields. The prisoners forced into this work understood its purpose immediately. They were witnesses, and witnesses were dangerous. Many expected to be killed once the task was complete. Some were. Others survived by chance, by delay, by the sheer disorganization of the retreating system. Even in collapse, the camp remained lethal. Outside the fences, the sounds of war grew closer. Distant artillery rumbled faintly at first, then louder, more distinct. The ground vibrated subtly beneath bare feet. These sounds brought terror, and hope in equal measure. Liberation, if it came, would not be gentle. It would arrive through violence, through chaos, through forces that did not know who was trapped inside the camp or in what condition. Guards argued openly now, their authority no longer unquestioned, even among themselves. Supplies dwindled. Food deliveries became irregular. Some guards stole from storage, preparing for flight. Others clung to routine, enforcing roll calls and punishments even as the system unraveled. Control persisted out of habit as much as intent. Prisoners watched closely, reading every sign. A guard suitcase left by a door. Papers burned hastily in an office. Vehicles loaded and unloaded repeatedly. These details became lifelines, clues to what might happen next. Survival depended on anticipation, on sensing whether to hide, to stay visible, to remain still. As evacuation continued, Majdanek became a camp of remnants. What remained was not a functioning system, but a shell, dangerous precisely because it was unstable. The rules that had once governed life and death, so predictably, now shifted daily. A guard who spared someone one day might shoot them the next. Chaos replaced order, and chaos favored no one. Some prisoners attempted escape during this period, driven by desperation. A few succeeded, slipping away under cover of confusion. Most were caught and killed. The camp's location, once a symbol of exposure, now worked against escape. Open fields offered no cover. Watchtowers still stood. The wires still cut the horizon. And yet, the impossible slowly approached. One morning, the guards were fewer. Roll call was delayed, then abandoned. Orders went unanswered. The camp felt unguarded in ways it never had before. Prisoners waited, afraid to move, afraid that any action would provoke retaliation. Hours passed, then more. The sound of artillery grew unmistakably close. When the Red Army finally arrived, it was sudden and anticlimactic in its own way. There was no dramatic battle at the gates. No heroic charge. The SS had fled, leaving behind what they could not erase. Soldiers entered cautiously, weapons raised, unsure of what they would find. What they found defied comprehension. The camp lay largely intact. Barracks still stood. Gas chambers still existed. Crematoria remained. Piles of shoes, clothing, personal belongings lay where they had been abandoned. Prisoners emerged slowly, hesitantly, unsure whether this was another trick, another phase of cruelty. Liberation felt unreal, dangerous, fragile. The soldiers were shocked by what they saw. Emaciated bodies. The smell of death lingering everywhere. Evidence of mass killing left in plain sight. Majdanek became the first major Nazi concentration camp liberated largely intact, its crimes visible without reconstruction or interpretation. The world would soon see what had happened here, not through survivor testimony alone, but through physical proof. For survivors, liberation did not mean immediate relief. Bodies were too weak, minds too fractured. Many died in the days and weeks that followed, unable to recover from prolonged starvation and disease. Freedom arrived too late for thousands, and in a form too harsh for others to fully grasp. The camp that had been built in plain sight, that had killed in plain sight, now stood as evidence in plain sight. Majdanek could not be denied, minimized, or erased. Its unfinished nature, once a feature of cruelty, became a record of truth. What the SS failed to destroy would speak for itself. And as the world began to absorb what Majdanek revealed, the camp entered a final transformation, from a place of hidden routine violence into a symbol, a warning, and a permanent scar on human history, one whose meaning would continue to unfold long after the last prisoner walked free. In the days after liberation, Majdanek did not feel like a place that had survived history. It felt like history itself had been left behind, raw and uncontained. There were no walls knocked down to hide what had happened, no ruins to soften the truth. The camp stood almost exactly as it had been, as if frozen at the moment the guards fled. Barracks still held bunks. Gas chambers still stood sealed, but intact. Crematoria ovens were cold, but unmistakable. The machinery of death had not been dismantled. It had simply been abandoned. Soviet soldiers moved through the camp cautiously, unsure where to step, unsure what horrors might still be concealed. They were trained for combat, not for this. Nothing in their experience prepared them for the sight of thousands of personal belongings piled in open spaces. Shoes in every size, children's coats, eyeglasses, prayer books, suitcases with names still written on them. These objects carried a weight heavier than bodies. They were evidence of lives interrupted, plans never fulfilled, people who had arrived believing they were being relocated, not erased. Survivors watched from a distance as soldiers explored the camp. Many were too weak to approach. Some could not stand. Others were afraid to move, conditioned by years of punishment for the smallest action. Liberation did not immediately undo fear. It did not restore trust. For some, the guard's absence felt temporary, like another trick designed to draw them out before killing resumed. Medical teams arrived quickly, but they were overwhelmed. Bodies that had endured starvation for months could not simply be fed. Many survivors died after liberation, their systems unable to process nourishment. Disease spread rapidly. Typhus and dysentery did not disappear with freedom. Doctors worked frantically, improvising care, learning as they went, but they were fighting damage that had accumulated over years. Journalists and investigators soon followed the soldiers. Majdanek became one of the first camps the world saw, almost untouched. There was no need for testimony to imagine what had happened. The evidence was visible everywhere. Mass graves, execution pits, gas chambers, ash scattered in fields and pressed into the soil. Photographs taken here shocked even those who had already heard rumors of Nazi atrocities. Denial became harder when confronted with structures built explicitly for killing. The camp was documented in detail. Measurements were taken. Facilities were examined. Survivors were interviewed, though many struggled to speak. Language failed repeatedly. How could words capture the scale, the routine nature of the violence, the way life had been dismantled piece by piece? Silence often said more than speech. Majdanek quickly became a symbol, not because it was the largest camp, but because it was the most visible. It had been built near a city. It had operated in plain sight. And now, its crimes were exposed without the SS having time to destroy the evidence. The camp contradicted every attempt to frame genocide as exaggeration or enemy propaganda. It stood as proof. For survivors, this visibility was double-edged. On one hand, it meant the world could see what they had endured. On the other, it meant reliving trauma repeatedly as officials, journalists, and visitors asked questions, took photographs, walked through spaces that had once been sites of terror. The camp became a place of testimony before survivors had time to heal. Some former prisoners remained in the area, unable or unwilling to leave immediately. They wandered through the camp, revisiting barracks, standing at the edges of pits where friends and family had died. These visits were painful but necessary. Many needed to see for themselves that the nightmare was truly over, that the structures that had defined their suffering no longer held power over them. Others left as soon as they could, desperate to put distance between themselves and the place that had nearly destroyed them. They carried Majdanek with them anyway, etched in a memory, resurfacing in dreams, in sudden panic, in moments of silence. Survival did not mean escape from the past. The legal reckoning began slowly. Investigators gathered names of guards, commanders, doctors. Some perpetrators had fled. Others were captured quickly. Trials would come, but they would never feel proportional to the crimes committed. How could sentences account for tens of thousands of lives erased? Justice, when it arrived, felt symbolic rather than sufficient. Majdanek's existence complicated post-war narratives. It challenged the idea that genocide had been hidden, secret, or unknowable. The camp had operated openly, visibly, efficiently. It forced uncomfortable questions about complicity, about what nearby populations knew, about how normal life continued alongside mass murder. As the war ended and Europe began the long process of rebuilding, Majdanek remained. It was not dismantled like some camps. It was preserved. This decision was deliberate. The camp would serve as a memorial, a warning, a place where denial would be confronted by physical reality. Visitors would walk the same paths prisoners had walked. They would see the same fences, the same barracks, the same killing facilities. Memory settled into the ground. Grass grew over disturbed earth, but it did not erase what lay beneath. The camp became quieter, but the silence was heavy, weighted with absence. Majdanek no longer killed, but it did not let anyone forget that it had. For survivors, the challenge became living with memory, building new lives in a world that felt fundamentally altered, explaining the inexplicable to children and grandchildren, facing disbelief, indifference, or fatigue from those who had not been there. Bearing witness became a lifelong responsibility, one many did not choose but could not escape. Majdanek's legacy extended beyond its fences. It shaped how the Holocaust was understood, documented, and remembered. It demonstrated that genocide was not chaos, but administration, not madness, but planning, not secrecy, but normalization of cruelty. These lessons would influence how future generations studied mass violence, how they recognized warning signs, how they understood the fragility of moral systems. Yet memory is not static. Over time, narratives shift. Attention fades. New crises emerge. Majdanek risks becoming a chapter in a textbook rather than a lived reality. Preserving its meaning requires more than preserving structures. It requires engagement, education, discomfort. As the camp transitioned from a site of suffering to a site of remembrance, a final question lingered, unresolved and unsettling. What does it mean that this place was built so close to ordinary life, and that ordinary life continued? That question does not belong only to history. It presses forward into the present. And as Majdanek stood, silent but unyielding, it demanded that anyone who walked its grounds confront not only what happened here, but what human beings are capable of when systems of power strip away empathy, normalize obedience, and allow cruelty to operate in the open. Time did not soften Majdanek. It changed how people approached it, how they spoke about it, how they tried to understand it, but it did not make the place easier to absorb. Years passed, borders shifted, governments fell and rose again, yet the camp remained stubbornly present. Visitors walked its paths carrying cameras, notebooks, flowers, questions. What they encountered was not just history preserved behind glass. It was a confrontation with how ordinary systems, ordinary language, and ordinary obedience had once produced extraordinary destruction. In the immediate post-war years, Majdanek became a site of testimony before the word itself had fully formed. Survivors returned with investigators, pointing to places where selections occurred, where shootings took place, where bodies were burned. Their voices were often flat, drained, not because memory had faded, but because emotion had been exhausted long ago. They did not speak to shock. They spoke to record. Many understood instinctively that disbelief would come later, that memory would be challenged, diluted, reshaped. Majdanek needed to be documented while it still spoke clearly through its structures. Trials followed, but unevenly. Some perpetrators were identified quickly, captured, and prosecuted. Others vanished into the chaos of retreat, blending into civilian life, changing names, suppressing pasts. Courtrooms attempted to impose order on crimes that had thrived on bureaucracy. Charges were read. Evidence was presented. Survivors testified again, recounting horrors they had already lived through once. Sentences were handed down, yet none could measure against the scale of loss. Justice felt partial, symbolic, fragile. The camp itself was transformed deliberately into a memorial. Unlike places that were destroyed or rebuilt, Majdanek was left standing. This decision carried weight. It meant visitors would not encounter ruins softened by time, but intact barracks, intact gas chambers, intact watchtowers. The camp would speak through its physical presence. The ground would not be sanitized. The evidence would not be abstract. As years passed, the role of Majdanek evolved. It became an educational site, a place where students walked quietly, where guides spoke in measured tones, where silence carried as much meaning as explanation. For some visitors, the experience was overwhelming. For others, it was unsettling in a different way. The camp's proximity to the city remained impossible to ignore. Streets lay just beyond the fences. Homes stood within sight. Life had once continued here while mass murder unfolded. That fact lingered, unanswered. Memory, however, is never stable. Political climates shifted. Narratives competed. In some periods, emphasis fell on certain victims more than others. In others, suffering was folded into broader, national stories of wartime loss. Majdanek resisted simplification. Its history refused to align neatly with comforting narratives of heroism or inevitability. It demanded confrontation with complicity, with passivity, with the ease of looking away. For survivors, the passage of time brought mixed burdens. Aging bodies carried memories that refused to age alongside them. Some found purpose in speaking, in returning to the camp with younger generations, in anchoring abstract history to lived experience. Others withdrew, unable to revisit a place that had consumed so much of their lives. Both responses were acts of survival. Neither erased the past. The objects left behind at Majdanek took on new meaning as decades passed. Shoes, glasses, suitcases were no longer just evidence of crime. They became bridges across time. Visitors paused before them, imagining the people who once owned them, the journeys they believed they were beginning, the futures they expected. These objects collapsed distance. They made history personal, immediate, uncomfortable. Denial emerged alongside remembrance, as it always does. Some questioned numbers. Others questioned intent. A few questioned reality itself. Majdanek stood in opposition to all of it. Its gas chambers were real. Its execution pits were real. Its records, its ash, its scars were real. The camp did not argue. It existed. In doing so, it exposed denial not as ignorance, but as choice. Education became one of the camp's most vital functions. Guides did not merely recite facts. They explained processes. How language was used to disguise killing. How efficiency was praised. How systems rewarded obedience and punished empathy. Majdanek became a case study in how genocide does not erupt suddenly, but is constructed step by step, decision by decision, form by form. For younger generations, the challenge was distance. The war receded further into the past. Survivors grew fewer. Memory risked becoming inherited rather than lived. Majdanek's preservation countered this drift. It offered physical reality where abstraction threatened to take over. Standing in the camp made it harder to dismiss, harder to relativize, harder to reduce to statistics. Yet, even preserved, Majdanek raised questions with no easy answers. How does one remember without turning suffering into spectacle? How does one teach without overwhelming? How does one honor victims without freezing them in their deaths alone? The camp forced curators, educators, and visitors alike to wrestle with these tensions continuously. The surrounding city changed over time. New buildings rose. Streets were repaved. Daily life continued. This coexistence remained unsettling. Majdanek was not isolated in memory any more than it had been in history. Its presence challenged the comforting illusion that atrocity belongs only to distant places or distant times. International visitors brought their own histories, their own frameworks of understanding. Some arrived seeking closure. Others came searching for warning signs relevant to their own societies. Majdanek met them all with the same unyielding testimony. This is what happens when human beings are reduced to categories. This is what happens when bureaucracy replaces conscience. This is what happens when violence is normalized. As decades passed, commemorations grew quieter, more reflective. The urgency of immediate aftermath gave way to the slow responsibility of stewardship. Majdanek was no longer just a site of mourning. It was a site of moral inquiry. What obligations do the living have to the dead? What responsibilities do societies bear once the perpetrators are gone, but the systems that enabled them still exist in different forms? The camp did not provide answers. It provided context. It forced comparison. It invited discomfort. In doing so, it fulfilled a role far beyond its physical boundaries. Majdanek became a mirror, reflecting not only the past but the present. And as time continued its steady march forward, a final challenge emerged, one that no preservation could fully resolve. How long can memory endure without witnesses? How does a place continue to speak when those who lived its reality are no longer there to guide interpretation? This question hangs over Majdanek now, unresolved, pressing toward the future. The camp stands ready, silent but insistent, waiting to see whether those who come after will listen closely enough to hear what it still has to say. The ground at Majdanek does not speak, yet it asks something of everyone who stands upon it. There are no commands anymore, no whistles cutting the air before dawn, no guards shouting numbers into the cold. What remains is space, silence, and the weight of knowing that this silence was earned through unimaginable noise. The final chapter of Majdanek's history does not belong to the SS, or to the war, or even solely to the survivors. It belongs to the living, and to the question of what is done with what has been learned. For those who walked out of Majdanek alive, survival did not feel like victory. It felt like obligation. Many carried guilt heavier than memory, wondering why they lived when others did not, why chance spared them when strength, kindness, or innocence did not guarantee survival. This question followed them into every stage of life that came after. It surfaced in quiet moments, in celebrations that felt undeserved, in children's faces that mirrored those lost. Liberation closed the gates of the camp, but it did not close the experience. Majdanek traveled with them, stitched into identity. Some survivors try to build new lives without looking back. They moved to different countries, changed names, avoided speaking about the past. Silence became a coping mechanism, a way to keep trauma contained. Others spoke endlessly, driven by the fear that if they stopped telling the story itself might disappear. Both paths carried pain. Both were shaped by what Majdanek had taken and what it had left behind. As decades passed, survivors aged, and their voices grew fewer. The responsibility of memory began to shift. Children and grandchildren inherited stories they could never fully understand, only carry forward. Majdanek became something they knew through fragments, photographs, testimonies, pauses in conversation where words failed. The challenge became how to honor experiences that defied comprehension without turning them into abstractions. Majdanek itself stood as a counterweight to forgetting. Unlike stories, it could not be reinterpreted easily. It did not soften with retelling. Visitors could walk the same paths prisoners walked, stand where selections occurred, enter buildings designed for death. This physicality mattered. It resisted the human tendency to distance oneself from horror by placing it safely in the past. Yet even physical places can lose meaning if treated casually. Over time, memorial sites risk becoming routine stops rather than confrontations. The danger is subtle. It arrives not through denial, but through familiarity. When horror becomes expected, it loses its power to disturb. Majdanek's final challenge is not preservation alone, but engagement, ensuring that those who visit do not merely observe, but reflect. Reflection leads inevitably to uncomfortable questions. Majdanek was not hidden. It was not buried deep in inaccessible forests. It operated beside a city, near homes, roads, ordinary routines. This reality complicates simple narratives of ignorance. It demands examination of how societies normalize violence when it is packaged as necessity, security, or efficiency. It forces recognition that atrocity does not require monsters alone, but systems that reward obedience and discourage empathy. The camp also challenges the idea that genocide is a sudden rupture. Majdanek was not built in a moment of madness. It evolved step by step. Decisions were incremental. Language softened reality. Each phase prepared the ground for the next. Understanding this progression matters because it reveals how easily moral boundaries can erode when each individual step seems manageable, justifiable, or distant from its final consequence. In this sense, Majdanek is not only a memorial to victims, but a warning to the present. It demonstrates how bureaucratic processes can become lethal when detached from human consequence. How professional roles, guards, clerks, doctors, engineers, can be absorbed into systems that produce death while individuals convince themselves they are merely performing tasks. The camp also exposes the fragility of rights when they are framed as conditional. Prisoners were stripped of protections gradually, labeled, categorized, reduced. Each label made the next act easier. Majdanek reminds us that the moment people are reduced to functions or categories, their vulnerability increases exponentially. For educators, Majdanek presents a responsibility that goes beyond recounting events. Teaching its history means guiding learners through complexity without simplifying suffering. It requires resisting the urge to extract easy lessons while still insisting that lessons exist. It means acknowledging that understanding does not guarantee prevention, but ignorance almost guarantees repetition. Commemoration rituals evolved over time, becoming quieter, more introspective. The absence of survivors at ceremonies grows more noticeable each year. Their physical presence once anchored memory to lived reality. Now, that anchor must be replaced by commitment. Commitment to truth, to accuracy, to refusing distortion or fatigue. Fatigue is perhaps the most insidious threat. In a world saturated with crisis, there is temptation to treat past atrocities as closed chapters, resolved through memorials and anniversaries. Majdanek resists closure. It remains unresolved not because history lacks an ending, but because its implications extend forward indefinitely. Standing in Majdanek today, one cannot escape the sense that this place is unfinished, not in construction, but in meaning. Each generation brings new questions shaped by its own challenges, new forms of dehumanization, new technologies that distance action from consequence, new systems that prioritize efficiency over dignity. Majdanek does not provide answers to these modern dilemmas, but it sharpens awareness of their danger. The camp also complicates the idea of progress. Humanity often measures advancement through technology, governance, economic growth. Majdanek forces a reckoning with the fact that modernity can coexist with mass murder, that systems capable of remarkable organization can be turned toward annihilation, that progress without ethics is not progress at all. For those who never experienced the camp, engaging with Majdanek is an act of humility. It requires acknowledging limits of understanding while still refusing indifference. It means accepting that some suffering cannot be fully grasped, but must still be respected. It demands listening to silence, reading absence, feeling discomfort without rushing to resolve it. Majdanek's story also honors resilience, not in the romanticized sense of triumph, but in the raw fact that human beings continued to think, feel, remember, and choose even under conditions designed to erase those capacities. This resilience does not redeem the suffering, but it affirms the humanity the camp sought to destroy. As the last chapter closes, Majdanek does not fade into history. It stands as a threshold between what was and what could be. Its fences no longer confine bodies, but its lessons remain urgent. The camp asks whether the structures that enabled it have truly disappeared, or whether they have simply changed form. The final question Majdanek leaves behind is not about the past alone. It is about vigilance, about attention, about the willingness to recognize early signs of dehumanization and to resist them before they harden into systems. It asks whether memory will be passive or whether it will shape action. The camp no longer kills, but still confronts. And as long as Majdanek stands, intact and unyielding, It insists that remembering is not enough unless it is paired with responsibility, and that the true end of its story depends not on what happened here, but on what humanity chooses to do with that knowledge now.